this special history group by Christina Peak. I see a lot of familiar faces, but for those that are new to the history group, I'm Dr. Natalie McGuire, the Curator for Social History and Community Engagement. And the history group is a forum to share ongoing research about Barbadian history, heritage, culture, art, and really share and discuss with our communities here. So I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker this evening, Christina Peak. Christina Peak is a Belgian British transdisciplinary artist, AHRC collaborative doctoral researcher with the University of Westminster and the National Archives, whose PhD research focuses on how archival research and eco-social art by decolonial and liberatory practices can inform regenerative practices in the Caribbean marine environment. Christina was artist in residence for the Transforming Collections project, led by UAL Decolonizing Arts Institute, partnered with UAL Creative Computing Institute, and close partnership with Tate from January 2024 to December 2024. Christina is currently working with the Hartman Museum on a permanent display for the Natural History Gallery exploring Caribbean perspectives and relationships with the sea. And the title of her presentation with us today is called Conjuring the Oceans, World Building Ancestral Cultural Ecosystems and Marine Imaginariums as Narratives of Futurity and Systems Change. So please join me in welcoming Christina.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you. And again, thank you again for listening me present today. I really appreciate it, and for the lovely tour and welcome that you've given me here at the museum, because it's been really wonderful. Okay, so my name is Christina Peak. As I'm going to touch on today, I'm going to touch on some of my PhD research at the University of Westminster and the National Archives in the UK. And some of the residency work I've been doing with Tate and UAL. So that was a 2-year residency, and that was used as a live case study. And then I think how that's led to this point really, and now to the fieldwork that I've been doing in Barbados over the last month. So I think one of the things I just want to start with, and it's just a little bit in terms of positioning who I am in this, because I think I'm very fortunate in the family I have. Come from Barbados, and also British part of the family. I'm a citizen of both Barbados and the UK, but I am very aware in terms of the positionality that I am situated. I'm based in London in the UK, and I've been travelling between the UK and Barbados all my life, but there's a very difference in terms of, when you're situated within Barbados, within the island, and then when you are, essentially moving within a kind of diasporal kind of setting, which is what I do. So I'm moving between those places, and there's a lot of strength and a lot of ways in which you can move between worlds, which I think has been something that I've been gifted with all my life, and my family, invested in that I could do that, because that wasn't a common experience when I was growing up in London, in the UK. A lot, obviously a lot of families coming over from Barbados and other Caribbean islands, when everyone was in the economic position to be constantly going back to the Caribbean all the time and being able to cement that position and cement that heritage and culture. But for my mum, it was very important for us that we considered Barbados to be our home, that it wasn't seen as a kind of tourist destination, or that it was optional in some way. It was who we are, and it was our heritage. So, I'm not trying to, I think sometimes there can be this, very loud voices in terms of the diaspora, but I just want to situate that as then I'm speaking from that kind of perspective, but I am very, very considerate of and amazed by the voices that come out of the Caribbean, in particular, Bajans historically and today, in terms of culture, arts, everything, as we have Terra Festa coming up, I think, as well. So going forward, so just to explain the title, so I think within my practice, what I do is that I build, or I like to think I build worlds in each time I have these commissions or exhibitions, and those worlds essentially kind of, as I'm going to explain, pull out stories from historical narrative, from historical record, but they also, I use a lot of kind of speculative kind of practice. So we can create all different permutations of worlds, of narratives, of different kind of ideas of what futures could be, and how that kind of can change society. So just to go over then the research. So for my PhD research with the National Archives, who are my collaborative partner. And I think also just acknowledging that, obviously, with British imperial history, we can understand the breadth in terms of the governance that is managed within the UK National Archives. It still is essentially, a government conduit agency, and current governance is also obviously logged there. But this also means, obviously, for any previous British territory, that those records are housed there. So acknowledging that kind of imperial history, which means that a lot of the archives relating to Barbados, part of the Colonial Office archives, are in the UK. So my PhD research, essentially, I describe as two strands or two parts. The first part is what I'm looking at is mapping the colonial ecological history of the Caribbean, but specifically looking at Barbados as a primary field site. So many times obviously and there's so much research and literature into colonial histories within the Caribbean. What I'm really fascinated by is looking at what is the ecological implications for that, what was the environmental impact of that. Obviously, in many ways we know about, say, for example, the formation of plantation systems, monocultures, what that means in terms of environmental impacts, deforestation, all these kinds of things. You also have, but for me, my primary interest is the marine environment. So an example of that would be, say, for example, the use of marine mammals in terms of blubber, oil within the plantations, within the sugar mills, meaning that some species were very early, came to extinction very early on in terms of early colonial periods, early colonisation. So that's what I'm mapping, with a particular interest within 1850 to 1950. And then the other half of that, I guess, is that if we use those histories to see a longer kind of perspective and record, say, going back 200, 300, 400, 500 years of climate change, of the colonial impact within climate and what that meant within the Caribbean region, specifically, obviously, again, looking from a British context in terms of English-speaking Caribbean, and again, looking at Barbados as a primary field site, I'm looking at, if we look at that, how do we get the kind of degradation and the impacts that we've seen, particularly on the marine environment, which is probably, I conservatively could say it's probably like the least kind of researched at the moment is marine degradation. We know very much what happens on land with people and the effects, but in the marine environment, many times the ocean is kind of seen maybe as a kind of static or a kind of void, because obviously, you have shipping, you have navigation, you have trade, transatlantic trade, obviously, enslaved peoples, you're moving across bodies of water. What I'm really interested in is not just, say, for example, if we're looking at those kind of maritime, for example, histories, but the very impact on biodiversity, on what that means on the health of marine environments, and how those can be implicated. So the other part of it is then, how can art be not just, say, the cultural intervention that it is, socially, educationally, but ecologically? So there are many really fascinating artists at the moment that are using, say, for example, sculpture to create, say, artificial reefs and things, as well as obviously scientific conservation practices is doing this. But for me, I'm looking at how, say, if you took sculpture, if that's situated within the marine environment, there's lots of ways you can link this to other different kinds of media and things where you can have multiple kind of entry points into how you can then learn about the marine environment, link into colonial histories and different things, and different series of things that's going on. So, for example, linking marine sculpture, you can link that with sensors and things. You can get live biodata. You can link that with animation, with film, with all different kinds of ways, and then, say, online platforms, different things. So there's lots of different convergences that you can have these multiple pathways of action. So now, for the Transforming Collections residency, when I say that my work's in two parts, so I work with the National Archives, that's the PhD collaborative partner, but I work as an artist and I work part-time. So what I use is that a lot of the projects I do with national museums and galleries in the UK, I use those projects to do live testing, live case studies of the research that I'm doing in my PhD. So this is my first year research. So the Transforming Collections residency, whereas with the PhD research, it's the National Archives, with this, University Arts London and the Tate, as well as a number of national collection partners within the UK, all came on board and part of this project. So AHRC is the Arts and Humanities Research Council that funded this. So this was a much larger project over about 4 years, of which I was just one strand. But what I was doing with this is that I was partnered with specific national collections, and again, my primary focus was looking at the Caribbean, and wherever I could, specifically looking at any kind of objects or content within the collections relating to Barbados specifically. But I think when we're looking at these collections of national partners, I'll mention in a minute, I think one of the things to kind of contextualize is a lot of the time, whenever it's in relation to the Caribbean, a lot of it is heavily going to be related to histories of enslavement in terms of the Caribbean region, in terms of its own autonomies, for example, or even, say, for example, Indigenous Caribbean kind of record settlement society. There's very little in those collections. And I think a lot of the time, although, you know, collections are acquired, they become larger and larger. So slight generalizations there, but there is a very small, within the collections, there is a very small representation. And even less than when you're looking at the marine environment. So actually we didn't have a kind of limiting in terms of a time period, because actually the collections were, the representation of the Caribbean region was so small, to limit it by a time period meant that, you know, it just seemed that you didn't really to actually work with at that time. So there was 4 phases of this residency, and the Transforming Collections title relates to this idea of looking at, imagine what can a 21st century collection look like? Would that mean linking up multiple institutions? How do you access those? How do you, say, for example, build in multivocality? Who are the voices that have been silenced? Who are those who have been negated? Who are those who have been consciously kind of withdrawn from the record? Other aspects are, what are the barriers to audiences accessing collections, museums? So, for example, again, with the colonial histories that we have, you know, barriers in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of gender, queer histories, for example. So many things are kind of taken out or not represented within the record itself. And then on top of that, you know, depending on kind of trends and the ways in which kind of maybe different practices develop, you'll see it depends on, like, say, for example, how different maybe societies, communities are represented. You know, many times there may be questions about, you know, are particular communities, are identities read as being optional or disposable because they come up because there's a specific maybe historical event or commemoration that's coming up, so therefore a history gets picked up of a community, but then it's put back down and then that programming goes where it usually would stand. So these kind of questions are the things that come up routinely, and I like to think are changing. So for this, there was 4 phases for when I was looking at, for this residency for me. So I was looking at the Caribbean region, again with the focus on the marine environment, what kind of representation could I find there? So this had 4 phases. So what I ended up designing was a cultural ecosystem health framework, which I will explain, a bit of a mouthful. Second phase was marine immersion. The third was speculative writing, and this concluded in an installation for exhibition at the Tate Modern that was looking at kind of ecologies of degradation and regeneration. So what do I mean by that when I'm talking about the cultural frame ecosystem health framework? So my approach to this residency was, from the research I'm doing, when you look at the marine environment, when you look at coral reefs, okay, so say gauge the health or degradation, say, of a marine environment coral reef, you look at biodiversity indicators. So say, for example, you'd have 7 species that you would look at to see, is this ecosystem, is it healthy or is it degraded? Because if you take out these kind of indicator species, you can see where there's degradation. You can also see where there's health, if they're obviously, you know, everything's functioning perfectly as it should be. So taking that kind of ecological paradigm, I then applied it to the collection of a museum and the galleries that were here. So for example, I then thought of it, right, imagine a collection, imagine it as an ecosystem. What would be the health or degradation of an ecosystem? What would be the cultural indicators to inform you to say whether it's healthy or whether it was degraded? So what I came up with was these 7 signs, these 7 indicators, specifically focusing again on the Caribbean region where I was looking at within these collections, to try and evaluate this. And again, this is me kind of speculatively putting this together. I think you could say, or someone told me this is a whole other PhD project that someone could do, but as a kind of speculative prompting these ideas, especially within a much larger funded research project between multiple institutions, these are the kind of questions that were being positioned. So for me, these are the 7 indicators that I put forward to kind of think of what a cultural ecosystem, the health of one would look like. So one was language, in terms of text. So depending on the collections that I'm working with, this could be heavily text-based, where you're looking at kind of, whether it's natural history, for example, books, or whether you're looking at, kind of travel accounts, or whatever the content is, but essentially text-based content. And within that, when we're looking at bias, again, you could be looking at, is it racial bias, gender bias, class bias, this kind of means how are things represented in that language. Second one is image. So again, an example of this could be the bias and representation of colonial social structures. I think it's amazing, within the museum here, how you see the depiction in different the different ways in which kind of colonial society was in Barbados. So how are these depicted? How is bias in terms of race, maybe in terms of gender, depicted in these things? So institutional reading, how does the institution read itself? So in this case, obviously many times in line with any institutional organisation, they'll have their, equality and diversity policy. They'll have their kind of strategy and all that kind of thing. With this, it was like speaking to curators, speaking to the staff. What is their relationship with their collection? How do they personally feel about it? How does it affect their personal research? How do they read the museum? Because they're in it every day, and these become, they become very close relationships. What do they think of the previous kind of their predecessors and how, historically, and especially with some of the institutions we have, they're going back, in terms of their founding, going back, 100 years. So it's like when you see these trends of how things have been collated, how things have been left, and you're coming in and then having to take these systems and then change it and make it so it's for specific to your society. Audience reading. How do audiences read and engage the collection? So again, that point I made about sometimes communities feeling that their identities are not really being considered or managed, or being sometimes extractive, or to feed into another kind of agenda potentially sometimes. I think a key example of this in the UK was when you had the 200-year commemoration of the abolition of enslavement. So you can think nationally there was a lot of kind of events and programming around this, but actually in terms of African and Caribbean communities, they feel very much, after all this programming happened, that they'd been used to commemorate a kind of national agenda, but actually they weren't really considered, and that they'd actually, it was serving something else rather than them, and then the programming, they were no longer visible. So things like, another would be eco-communal origin. So many times we think of where objects derive from, the originating kind of society, maybe geographical region. For me, what I also bring into this is the environmental kind of origin, not necessarily in terms of geographies, but thinking of, thinking of species, thinking of what that means in terms of almost like a multi-species context. So we're not just talking about person, but we're talking about nature, environment, and that also that acknowledgement of many things are made from like natural products and stuff. So coding. How is the institution visually and experientially coded by others? So I think as an artist, actually, you're in a very unique position. So you have the institutional reading of how people within the institution read themselves. You think of, then you have audience reading as how audiences and diverse audiences are coming through and engaging with that institution. But then you also have people who are coming in completely different kind of positionalities and modes. So as an artist, you're coming in as an audience member many times, you're engaging with that collection, you're viewing the work and obviously appreciating that kind of context. But you're also coming in terms of professional context, maybe you're engaging in collections as I do. So you could be in museum stores seeing things. I almost think of sometimes in times like museums like icebergs, you see like maybe 3 to 5% of the collection, and the other 95% is in stores. So much of where I am is me in warehouses actually, just like going through like material. And then the 7th was absence of material indicating loss or damage. So again, this is another ecological paradigm. So obviously, when we think environmentally, we think, when a species become extinct, it no longer exists. But to me, again, putting it in the cultural sphere, in this kind of idea of a collection or a cultural ecosystem, what does loss and damage indicate when it's the degradation or the displacement or the erasure of a people, of their culture, of the history, of them not being in the record as well? So it's not just in terms of the environmental context, but in terms of the social, humanitarian context, if you like. So this is how I read them. So over these signs, what I was doing was going into collections, and a lot of this I was kind of documenting myself as this and through, and these are actually some of the partners I was working with. So the Welcome Collection. So the Welcome Collection in the UK, I don't know if everyone is aware, but the Welcome Collection really is a kind of, let's say, medical health, well-being, health kind of collection. But actually, and founded, you know, back in the Victorian period by Wellcome. And now, I mean, but his collection expanded, their collection expanded massively, because to contextualize, actually, I think what he studied up was like medical like tools and specimens. But to contextualize the collection, you have to kind of contextualize it with the world in which it's living in. So he started opening up that collection, so it can contextualize. So now you have things, for example, to natural history, to things like I think there's works in there in relation to like Egyptian kind of spiritual and magical practices and all this kind of stuff. It's a really vast collection. So ISM is the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. Obviously, Liverpool being the port that it was in the UK during the British Empire was obviously a key port when it came to enslavement, when it came to trade and lots of different things. And then you have the World Museum, much akin if you've heard of the British Museum. So you're talking about entire breadth of collection spanning so many different kind of societies and cultures, you know, I mean, and gosh, I'm trying to think how far they went. Before the Egyptian period, I mean, yeah, very, very early. I'm trying to think of the earliest now. And then also, they also include, say, for example, natural history and things as well. So they've really got a kind of a wide breadth. British Council. So British Council was essentially represented the British government in terms of international relations and foreign policy. And now doesn't necessarily carry that kind of position anymore, but it again supports kind of British international relations. So again, this is much more kind of governmental focus. And then INIVA is the Institute of International Visual Artists. So INIVA is almost like, sometimes I think almost like the counterpoint in some ways, without trying to contextualize them through mirroring of the other. But they're not having a colonial foundation in that kind of context. So they are a majority-based, you know, organisation representing arts across artists and the representation of those cultures across the world and those practices. But that's from the late 20th century. So this really is, for me, represented the autonomy of artists in terms of from the Caribbean, across continental Africa, Central and South America, all these kind of places. But again, there was a voice that had its autonomy when I was looking at other artists and practices and writers around these ideas. So I've just highlighted this piece actually because, again, in the collection, you've got indigenous pieces that have been found in Barbados. And again, this piece is actually from the World Museum in Liverpool. So I think it's just highlighting, it's, you know, where pieces and objects actually across the collections where they are, but also in many ways, in my head, I think where they interconnect. So taking this forward then, so I'm going to these museums, I'm going into their collections, I'm wandering about in their warehouses and their stores, and doing these kind of they were very long form interviews because it was fascinating hearing the curators talk about their ideas about their museums, their ideas in terms of like things like repatriation, for example. What would they think of the, you know, the forward kind of ambitions and ideations they have for their collections, for their organisations, and also for their local communities, which has, you know, who are constantly engaging with the programming that you're doing. So for me, I'm documenting all these through journals, through film, through photography. At the same time, this machine learning is coming into this residency as well, because when these national partners are looking at their collections, and I mentioned quite a few times about bias, some of the things that prime research question is, what are the barriers to audiences engaging collections? So one of the research strands for this was, how can machine learning support kind of identifying bias and therefore being able to create interventions for it? So while I'm creating and documenting all this content, say in the Wellcome collection, I'm looking at texts from like the 17th and 18th century, particularly in Barbados in regards to natural history, for example. I'm looking at other collections, and I'm looking at accounts in terms of like colonial accounts, in terms of like things like, I don't know, like shark attacks, for example. And actually, that's a weird kind of aspect in and of itself, because there's a lot of diverse narrative, even something like shark attacks actually, because when you're looking at the colonial period for sailors, these are creatures, I think probably, I mean, separate to Jaws, is probably one of the most demonized creatures that you have, especially within the marine environment. And you have account after account of them being mutilated before anything happens because of a perceived incident that may have happened, or one that may have happened to another kin, say that you don't know about. And then there's the other kind of aspect of it when we're talking about enslavement, where there's, you know, seeing slaves being attacked by sharks, no intervention being needed because they've been left in places where they know there's shark-infested waters. right, where the sailors have kind of covered themselves, or in what can be quite, you know, much of kind of harder context to imagine, but there is that where they're used as a way of release, in the sense that going overboard, trying to save yourself from the Middle Passage, and what's going to be happening when you get to the plantation system, when you get to somewhere like Barbados, that going overboard and having that encounter with the shark will be the way that you'll be able to release to go back to your own country. So it becomes a kind of, there's also a whole kind of ancestral kind of ideas and cosmologies, and this idea that kind of forms out of that. So it's a very, as I said, there'll be a lot of divergent narratives actually just within that aspect. So for me, I'm reading all these accounts and I'm looking at these objects, and to me, just to highlight, I don't like to think of a lot of the things I deal with in museums as objects. I almost like to think of them as entities or living knowledge systems, because to me that's what they are. And especially, I think many times in the context, especially when you're looking at spiritual practice, these things are heavily enriched, powerful kind of entities that are not seen as being, have losing that power. Many times they're seen as being dormant, for example, and that can be enacted, or that they're in contention or in conflict with those that they sit with, not just in terms of the galleries of a museum, but actually in terms of the warehouses and the way that they're stored sometimes. So while I'm developing this kind of machine learning application to be able to surface bias and see how I can raise this in like text, because for museums, if they can go through their content and they can highlight these things and they can then have these interventions to also address kind of audiences being able to engage with what they're doing, but also to address much longer term kind of social, political, economic barriers that have been there, and, you know, staff, practitioners, everything socially. And then the other part of this is that when I'm doing all this work, to me, I need to lead it back into the marine environment, because I'm looking at the historical record, I'm looking at these entities, but to me, bringing it back to the marine environment, almost kind of acting out a lot of the stories and the narratives that I'm reading about. So actually, what this led to was, like, in relation to the sharks, I ended up going down to Cornwall, because I tried to come to Barbados actually. I did a whole business case for everything, but they weren't going to have it. So I ended up finding Cornwall, which is a stunning coastal area in southern England. But it's very close to Barbados in the sense that, you know, like the water, the clarity, the colour of the water, these kind of things. Like, it's the closest that you can get to that kind of environment until you actually go in it, and then it's extremely cold and you feel like your nervous system's being rearranged, because then it's just yeah. So you've got full wetsuit and everything, but it's the closest that I could get to it. But then what I found happening was, so for example, I was like 20 miles off the coast filming blue sharks. So I'm in the water with these blue sharks, and the blue sharks actually, they have this almost like counter transatlantic enslavement route, because they come up through Central and South America, coming up then past the Caribbean, going to North America, and then they go over the Atlantic and come over to Britain in like the late summer. So they're almost doing like these kind of like reverse routes sometimes. So you're with these creatures in the water, and many of these accounts that I've read and things are kind of going through my mind, and you kind of going through these kind of immersive kind of process of kind of critical fabulation with these creatures and these ideas of like ancestors living beside them, because they're this kind of live fast, die young creature actually. They live very quick lives, but they cover huge distances. And I think the other thing to highlight here is that many times, you know, we think of kind of intergenerational trauma, not just in families or communities, but when we're thinking of like, you know, longer term periods in terms of things like colonial histories and things. But I think sometimes which gets left out of it is also the intergenerational trauma of species with environments, where you're, you know, where whole kinships, whole species are gone and they're extinct for, obviously for a specific purpose, like I said about the like marine mammals. But also it is this kind of context where they learn, and those, you know, we talk about it in humans, there's more research about how trauma and memory reside within the body genetically and how these things are passed down. And I don't think it's outlandish to imagine that species also have the same learnings and feed down the same kind of genetic kind of knowledges and things as well. So yeah, Cornwall became this kind of Bayesian British kind of imaginarium where you had things like the Caribbean seal, which was extinct very early on in colonisation during the colonial period, early colonial period, that then became like, then the seals that you had off the coast became like these spectres of those that were already extinct that were gone through these other kind of kinship in terms of these species. The blue sharks that were there again, you know, so they become this like kind of haunted, almost kind of spectral marine imaginary. And that's how they kind of ended up yeah, that's how the marine environment, I tried to bring it back together. So basically from going and engaging in these collections, and then with the development of the machine learning application, what we ended up was trying to highlight, as I said, I was focused on ecological bias and racial bias. So some of the things I was using the machine application to kind of learn from is that if you had to grade bias from like 1 to 5, you have to be able to teach a machine to do that. What does that look like? So it's literally, if I had a passage, for example, and there was one I remember reading about Barbados about turtles. I mean, a whole chapter on the turtles again, and they are everywhere. They're almost seen as like the most easily hunted creature because they're literally just sleeping in the water and you can just pluck them out. You don't have to do anything to get them, they're there. And like, pages just about how you basically present them, cook them, eat them, all different kinds of ways of eating them, all different kinds of recipes, all the different ways that they're being used. And in some ways, when I was answering these questions, it's like, right, well, I could say that in this period in, late 1600s, it's given me a picture of health because there's numerous numbers of them. It's like they're describing it like there's more than they can possibly do with them, right? There's so many numbers that no matter how many they take, it's like there's this infinite amount of these turtles that are here. However, the other way to read it as well is that the consumption, the rate by which these creatures are being consumed is so voracious that you've also got actually an indicator of kind of quite extreme degradation because you're seeing the species decline so quickly because if you're looking at the 17th century and then you're looking at the 18th century, they're completely different accounts. Species get smaller, for example. I mean, we see that now, something like the flying fish from when you have records of how large they were before to how they are now and they're being fished. So what we were looking at was this idea of trying to correlate what does ecosystem health look like, in an ecological sense and in a kind of racial cultural sense. So for example, when we were doing the application, it was like, right, if I'm looking at racial bias, worst acts of degradation, right, is extinction, loss, is the complete displacement or the erasure of a society, of a people, of their culture, of everything. That's going to be 5, that's your extreme. Number 1 is going to be the perfect kind of circumstances or conditions where a society can function. It's whether it's the individual, family, community. So for example, that's ideas of kind of reciprocity. That's ideas that you have the capacity to produce culture because you have the investment, you have the time to be able to do that. It's the idea of spiritual practice. It's the idea of kind of communal bonding. It's the idea of being able to have the capacity to look outside, whatever is the kind of critical survival kind of needs that you have to be able to provide for them. And we also looked at that in terms of ecological context. So, for example, what is species loss? We know that it's extinction. What's the healthiest environment? Well, where species get to propagate, they get to live. And again, actually, things like play and different things are able to be there because you're not having so much kind of trauma. So putting these together, what we ended up finding is that when you overlay race, the racial bias with the ecological bias, what you end up having is actually multi-species context. You see that ecocide and genocide are actually intrinsically linked. You do not have one without absolutely kind of environmental degradation with the other many times because one feeds into the other. The same thing with that ecosystem health many times. The correlations between the environment and ecosystem of a people, the health of the flourishing of them, and then also, with the environment when you have this kind of perfect semblance. So, but what the application also showed is this constant kind of up and down, up and down. So I was literally doing it sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, but in that you could have multiple connotations of health and degradation. So it was this constant conduit, and that also takes into account things like resistance, rebellion, right? So that to me was ecosystem. You can say it's degradation because you're having to rebel, you're having to have organized kind of insurgency within places like Barbados when we think of Bussa, for example. But I also thought that as ecosystem health because you were doing that. The capacity and the leadership and the potential for organisation, even under extreme kind of terrorism, which is what the circumstances that we're talking about in terms of, if you think of it in a temporary context, that you're able and you're still able to coordinate in some context. So there's different ways in which these kind of permeated. So what ended up happening is that these kind of led into this kind of ancestral kind of visual spiritual language, I think for want of a better word, where the ratings used for the machine learning became sigils. So they became almost like invocations. So when I was doing film and animation, it was like these symbols became these evocations where I was representing the historical record, but also maybe also kind of these invocations of like, right, I want there to be health in this context. I want there to be regeneration. I want there to be restoration, and almost imprinting these like tattoos or symbols on the scene and the imagery that we had. So what I also was doing during this time with the immersive work in sea, and also with the collections and documenting from the journals, that I started doing speculative writing. So for me, it was trying to document not only what was happening, my reactions to it, and also, as I said, like the kind of critical fabulation that you had in terms of what was happening in terms of the marine environment. But also, I think it was this idea of trying to bring through these kind of stories that were coming through, trying to find these kind of thematics and these threads and kind of linking them together. So how the residency ended up progressing was this. So this was an extract taken from the Divination Bowl, the last mangrove, Graham Hall Sanctuary, Barbados. And I'll show you what that relates to. But to me, what it ended up being was this kind of convergence of narrative, and I could then like flesh them out. So what we had here is that we ended up having 4 artworks essentially, which were which was symbiotic. So basically these were sculptures with kind of film projections upon them, animating them, trying to represent that idea of like a living novel system. But essentially what you had, it was that for each artwork, for each particular specific kind of piece, is that each one represented its own cultural ecosystem. So actually from the different collections and the multiple partners that you had, specific stories and things were coming out of them, specific histories were surfaced. But what seems actually very logical is that many of the same stories were appearing in different collections because of the time and the period and acquisition and different things, that these stories are actually mimicking each other in different collections. So the different artworks, basically, essentially each of them was like a cultural ecosystem. It's bringing out these different stories, each one representing particular thematics that were coming out of the collection. So for example, the Maroon's Diadem, in terms of the speculative kind of storytelling I was doing, this was linking to stories about rebellion and things on the plantations that were happening in Barbados, but also the idea of it going beyond. Many times when we think of like kind of physical violence, we see there's psychological, there's emotional, but actually beyond that, accounts of this idea of soul bondage, where enslaved people were kind of told how this wasn't just this idea of like that I own you physically as property. It was this idea that I own your soul. I will hold your soul and you will never return from where you come back from. This idea of complete soul, conceptual, cosmological bondage and ownership beyond the physical and what your role was. So in this speculative narrative, what was coming out was this idea of like speculative maroon communities in Barbados that were being enacted. So this actually was the crown or the diadem piece, as I call it, was actually this idea of a female defense system or weapon actually that would be braided into the hair using centipede kind of toxin to put on the edges. So when they were fighting and going under the cover of darkness, you know what I mean? Then there's like kind of like the sigils and things were on the kind of corals and things that are attached to these headpieces. So these invocations from the sea empowered like the wearer. So and they were covered in molasses. So again, in the cover of night, although like because this person speculatively is a key kind of leader and an agitator and provocateur, if you like, in terms of leading the insurgency, it's also this idea that they're also, you know, this idea of kind of black ops, if you like, in a marine context. So you're covered in molasses and you've got like, you know what I mean, you're feeding into the dance, but they've also kind of like pillaged this like, you know, brass and stuff and gone under and making these kind of weapons to kind of consolidate and show they are, but they actually are embedded within the kind of fighting systems that they use. Wayfinding shells built on narratives again of indigenous communities and societies exiting Barbados, or the narratives that were found of that. But with the wayfinding shells, it was this idea of wayfinding that comes up in a lot of kind of indigenous kind of cosmological kind of thought, navigation and society. But in these kind of narrative, these were speculative shells, well, speculative kind of storytelling. Again, so the interior had, say, shark's teeth, different kind of things embedded in it as physical features. But that interior was actually an underworld. So that mapped the marine environment, but it was actually mapped conceptually the kind of, say, for example, the ancestral kind of mapping of where your ancestors were. it was supposed to act as like a knowledge repository. So wherever you went, wherever you journeyed, it would remember those journeys. So when you had to leave in an emergency situation under that pressure, it's finding your way from that and taking your way to where you need to go, if that's St. Vincent or wherever else in these contexts. The other side on the exterior was the land, and again, physical creatures using shark's teeth and shell and different things again, so you could map the land, see where the places of spirituality, places of water, places of hunting, for example. So these were shells that formed maps. The divination bowl was this idea that where we have the mangroves in Barbados, you know, they are a nexus, I like to think of them as. It's where fresh water meets salt water, which this is where you can have coral assemblages as well. So, you know, on trees, which is like fascinating. They're nurseries for, you know, for young kind of marine biodiversity. And in this case, in this story, they're also a nexus for the spiritual practitioners that are supporting the fight of the Maroons that you have here, of Indigenous people, whether they're exiting but also staying to fight. So what you have is African descendant practitioners, you have Indigenous practitioners, and you have others that are forming as well in this kind of creolization of what's happening during this period of time. So the divination bowl in this story is set in modern day in the fact that it's basically salvaged and seen as this kind of archaeological kind of find in Barbados. And it then becomes this spearhead for a wave of kind of activism in where it's just looking at kind of maintaining and preserving archaeological sites within Barbados. And the communities actually fight to have this returned back to the environment rather than it being necessarily put in a museum, because they want the place not just to be the bowl to be where it originally stood, because of things like degradation of the mangroves and things, because of like water pollution and stuff, minerals and things have embedded themselves into it from what the colour it actually was, is this kind of like bronzed black kind of colour embedded with corals and things. But they want it to also be reactivated as a site, as a spiritual nexus site. And then the last one, submerged mother, was this idea of, you know, the sea in many ways can give autonomy. So when we have emancipation, what you also have is that the sea enabled, when many, you know, are pressured and have to go back to plantation, fishing enables an autonomy in terms of a living where there's some kind of, you know, there's some kind of aspect to not have to fall into that to some extent. So places like St. James, for example, had a different kind of cultural system because, you know, formerly enslaved people were able to use fishing and things to propagate and bring in money. So I also thought it this way, is that this idea of offerings back to the sea as well. So for everything that is taken, these this mother image, if you like, the sculpture image, has coral frags embedded into it. So when you give back to the sea. So coral frags, even if you have a slight bit of coral, a few of the polyps are alive. If you put that back into the sea, it can rebuild itself, and you can recreate new coral reef areas actually. So this idea of constantly restoring and constantly regenerating the reefs that you're taking from. So this work was featured in the Tate Modern last year in October. And as I said, featured as this kind of live case study. And now going forward, and I realise I've gone quite a bit over time, so I'll hurry up. Going forward now, for the second live case study for the second year of the PhD, I'm working with the Hartman Museum in London. And as I said, looking at kind of the relationship to marine environment, but this is almost taking that relationship the next part now. So why one of the reasons I'm here to do field work within Barbados, not just for the PhD, but looking and documenting what's happening to the marine environment here, correlating it. You know, I'm in the National Archives, but that's very much, you know, that's the colonial voice of British government. It is what it is. And it doesn't pretend to be anything else. So then when you're home and you speak and you hear, like my grandfather here, you know, yeah, he's 90, he's that, yeah, honestly. And you hear the stories and you listen, you know, it's again kind of immersing it back into like having that kind of storytelling of, and listening to the histories and things that people have lived, trying to immerse yourself back into it. Because I will say sometimes it's so easy to have distance and to sanitize, especially when the voices are sanitizing the very histories that you're reading. It's very easy to fall into that in some ways, as well as also finding yourself feeling a bit degraded by it because the dehumanization is happening within the text. So that's one of the reasons, as I said, while I was here. But I think one of the things I wanted to highlight as a result of this residency and going forward is that when it comes to my research, I think I'm heavily influenced by philosophers from across the Caribbean, because I think the Caribbean has produced some of the most incredible, radical just utterly inspiring kind of like philosophers, thinkers, every kind of context, I think, in terms of like freedom and thought and radical nature in terms of change. When you think of a region and how it's been made with its in terms of its colonial history, how you have this constant, you know, fighting in terms of like freedom, organized, coordinated, like, you know, this intelligentsia that goes throughout the region historically, that people like, for example, like Sylvia Wynter are people that I massively influenced my work, and with her as well, I think this idea of storytelling, especially when you're an artist. So for her, it's in many ways it's this idea that you map the cosmos around you to be able to build your world upon it. So for everything that you have to have an origin story. It's the way you map your world, it's the way you read it, and then you build the structures within it. So when you have colonialism, you have to map the origin story that goes with it. And when you're looking at kind of radicalization, this idea of like the idea of the creation of the conception of race, for example, when you're looking at all these different things, the way in which, say, maybe like religion is used, Christianity is used, all these different kinds of things, you have to create the origin story, the basis, to be able to then build the structure on it to kind of justify what you have, to make it live and kind of breathe. You know, we're told stories from when we're children. Although it feels like it doesn't change in terms of adults. We still have to map the world around us and then understand the structures that we're in to live them. And so if you can change those structures, if you can change the stories, then you can change the structures and the way they live in many ways. So I think, you know, Wynter puts forward these kind of ideas of like, you know, what is beyond man? Like, what is, you know, the beyond human? What is the next step in terms of our progression, like kind of as a species ourselves, as people, as humans, and what does that look like? Especially, you know, incredible ideas in terms of like, in terms of addressing colonialism. But I think for me, when I asked myself those questions that Wynter kind of puts forward, to me, that was ideas of multi-species context and entanglements. So many times we're siloed. You have the human and you have nature. But again, as I said, they're interconnected in every kind of context that we are. And so when we're looking at kind of, when I'm thinking of regenerative practice, restorative practice, especially when we're addressing like global issues like climate and different things, I'm looking at one place in terms of like, I'm looking in Barbados, but I'm very aware of what's happening in the UK, and bodies of water are connected. You know, marine environments are connected. They do not act independently, even though our nation states and borders put very different messages in terms of who has access to what they have, economics, socially, politics, all those kind of things. So to me, I think that's a key kind of outcome and learning of that. And I think for me, this is why the fascination with the marine environment in Barbados. So going forward, in terms of the fieldwork that was here, the primary aim of the fieldwork here was to document the degradation of the coral reefs in Barbados and their health. That's what I really want to see, is health. I know degradation always seems to be the thing that's heard, and it is that. Let's be honest, a lot of that's been happening. You have this kind of slow violence in terms of colonialism and so many different things where, you know, you're getting to this point. And by the mid 20th century, you know, or 1966, you know, Barbados has independence, but, you know, when we have the rise of, say, for example, like tourism and different things, like the way in which land is managed, like water runoff, pesticides, like, you know, construction, all these different kinds of things. And again, I'm not trying to situate Barbados as being the only one in this context. God knows, you know, it's the same thing in many places all over the world, because it's what happens in terms of the creation of things, in terms of what you see there. But when you're looking at Barbados and you're looking at the convergence of these things, and then so separate to climate change, right, and sea temperature and all these things, and then you have the construction sediment going into water, you've got pesticides, you've got, say for example, you've then also got diseases that are travelling through the Caribbean, attacking the reef building coral. So there were so many. There's actually the Hartman Museum that I'm doing the commission with. They have a coral research project, so they're working internationally all over the world, and what they do is that they model marine environments and create the spaces whereby they can then propagate, and actually they've made corals kind of self-spawn, which is very, very difficult to do. And they have these marine environments, and then they kind of create corals in which they can go back and then they can be installed there. But they take these modelling of these environments and put them in different places like Indonesia, Australia, places. And I said, you know, why is it that with all the research that I'm reading about what you do, like why is it that, you know, the Caribbean isn't being somewhere that's seeing more intervention? Because, you know, from what I'm reading all the time, there's not actually that much of a light put on it, but actually it's one of the most degraded areas globally, from what I understand, across the Caribbean, not to mention things like sargassum, all these kinds of things. And they said it's because, and the creator I spoke to there said it's because the Caribbean region is so difficult to model because it has so many factors affecting its health, that for you to model a climate intervention, an ecological and marine intervention for it is so hard. So it's almost like modelling others, they can do that and try to do the interventions where they can, but something like the Caribbean region actually is so much complex and the factors that are affecting it. So for me, I wanted to document that, so I started off in Folkestone, looking at that. And as you can see, there's still areas where it's like, you know, where you can find these corals of different things growing. So, and across the West Coast, the majority of the degradation is there. You know, you talk to whether it's like, so they were doing like outreach, for example. So, you know, you're going out on the glass bottom boat and they're talking to you about it. Fishermen are talking to you about it. Lots of different, you know, divers when we've been diving here, they're, you know, speaking about it. So it's common knowledge in this context. And I think things like when you're seeing in Barbados, things like the Ocean Innovation Hub, you're talking about like swimming being kind of compulsory now. I think it's being compulsory in the national curriculum, for example. All these different ways in which, from what I'm seeing as well, the way in which, you know, from what is the international kind of agenda of Barbados being very vocal in terms of climate as well as reparations, for example, but also how these different interventions are lining up in terms of communities, in terms of literacy, in terms of environmental literacy, all these different kind of things are really interesting to see. So I've been sitting in on like when they've had the camps, for example, and what the kids are doing and the lectures that are being given, and it's been fascinating to see what people are doing. You know, trips that are being given like to local people so they can be able to go and see, you know, the corals and different things and be able to swim out there, because you have to be quite confident actually sometimes. I might do this for a living, but honestly I get very scared in deep water. It's the irony, absolute irony of my life. And I'm not going to tell you about the diving experience I had because that, yeah. So I think one of the things I want to show for that is, so that's what I've been kind of doing here. So I just showed some brief pictures. I'm going to bring this to a close. So this is my son and my mum. So we're doing a little bit of a beach cleanup. You know, that was mum's idea off her own back. Went and got some bin bags from the lady. But I think this highlights two things. One is the amount of rubbish that you had across the coast by Bathsheba and stuff. Right, a lot of rubbish. But again, just to contextualize, this is a lot of rubbish coming in off the Atlantic. You know, when we were looking at here, I've got a picture of this flip-flop and it's covered in barnacles. Can you imagine for something to have barnacles embedded in it, how long it's been at sea before it's coming up on the coast, on the east coast in Barbados? So, you know, this is a lot of waste that's coming up here. And it's not just here. I've seen this in Sri Lanka. I've seen this in lots of other, you know, places where I've gone, and it's, you know, you're seeing these massive kind of islands, which like coming up on different islands. But this, again, is the other thing that's in this picture is the sargassum. Again, you have an ecological kind of phenomenon that's kind of happening, changing because of the climate conditions. And I think that's another thing to kind of, you know, think of. I mean, I've met scientists actually at a recent conference where they found a way apparently to take sargassum and turn it into biochar. So apparently this reduces the toxicity in agricultural land, which I had no idea. But that was very interesting. So the pockets that I found, I think they're very gorgeous, and I'm bringing this to a close. So I think in Folkestone Marine Park alone, there are these pockets and there are these corals there. And I think it's so incredible, the kind of, especially because to me, because they're these symbiotic kind of creatures, they're just absolutely stunning. And, you know, actually there was a time when they were used as a metaphor for British colonialism, because they colonize the reefs, they build on top of each other. They were used as this kind of like exotic kind of marine metaphor for the British colonizing and building upon what was there before and taking over it, and they've almost been like this kind of hostile marine kind of, I mean, I think that's very harsh, but very harsh PR, but it was one of the things they put forward. But one of the things I would want to say is that when we have been diving, you know, there are some stunning reef here, and I think the thing to take away, and I know I've used that word degradation a lot, but yes, that's happening, and it's happening in a lot of different places. I mean, there's parts of, like in the UK, where there's areas where they're ecologically dead because of raw sewage going out and different things. Those are things that are happening in a lot of different places. And I'm very aware of the work that I do, ideally, almost in that diaspora idea. What I'm trying to do is maybe do the same in the UK and in Barbados in this way of that. I come from diaspora, Asian diaspora, and the amount of that Asians and Caribbean people have contributed to the UK in changing so many ways in which, you know, addressing so many things in terms of race, in terms of culture, in terms of society and politics is phenomenal. And for me, there's a reciprocity here. Barbados has given me so much, so I like to think I'm giving back to it, well, trying to in the ways that I can and the skill sets that I have. But they are stunning places where they are living, where they are doing beautifully well. And these things are like huge, you know? I mean, I don't have a scale there, but, and I guess my point is that I think the key thing in my practice, although I talk about decolonial, is because you need to pinpoint where you can do regeneration and restoration. If you know what the issue is and you know when it's there, what can you then can't start to kind of scope and cite and model how you're going to address it. And with what I'm doing, that's what I'm hoping to do. So although it has been quite hard over the last month, seeing different areas, I think when you see the sites, even when it's the smallest pocket of where you see that you know, something is just like fighting and it's there and it's living and you're just like, yes, that's awesome, I'm going to photograph you because right on, you're doing it, I'm here for it. Do you know what I mean? So that's when I think, you know, that's when I'm very happy for it. And I think, you know, it's just the marine territory of Barbados, it's something like 450 times its size. Can you imagine that in this respect, the marine territory? So when I'm in these marine environments, sometimes as well, this is the thing I think around Barbados, is that it's such a mighty island, but it is this coral reef actually, but you're talking about a coral reef actually that extends for miles and miles and miles. So there's so much to kind of care for and to see and support. So bringing that to a close. Yeah, sorry, I went on a little bit. I do appreciate it, and I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so yeah, and I know that's my son. That's when I turn him into this kind of coral human-esque person. Yeah, I know, babe, I know. This is David and Goliath moment with his like coral, I know, babe, I know. With his coral slingshot, but it makes the point, because actually I did this in between Barbados, but also when I was working in the Peruvian Amazon, and you just see mass logging and different things that were happening there. So again, the environment, the things that you see happen in different places, the way in which different people are handling them and their different histories is quite exceptional. But I think it's the way in which people recover from them, regenerate and restore as well is absolutely exceptional. So yeah, that's me, and I'm sorry I went on. Sorry, I know I went over our time quite a bit.
Research is going on that I think that really fits in with a lot of the work that our artists are doing here, cultural practitioners, and some of the inquiries that we have here at the museum. So we do have time for questions as soon as we have the mic set up. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions or comments, both those that are here with us in person or those that are watching online?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, for our online audiences.
Hey, I'm wearing one. Go with it. Just go with it.
My question was about the 7 indicators, and I know you said they were sort of speculative, but I wonder if you had a hard time sort of honing in on those 7, because I feel like it could either be sort of this infinite amount of indicators, or it could be one major indicator. So can you talk a little bit about the process of honing in on those 7?
Yeah, of course. I think, okay, being purely practical, when you are taking on, whether it's residency, I think a project in any context, you have the parameters of what that is. So a certain context, because we were working with the Creative Computing Institute, and what they were able to do in terms of machine learning, especially because, I mean, it was a real opportunity. I mean, for me personally, I hadn't seen the opportunity for me to work to create a bespoke machine learning application, you know, with a creative computing group as part of a residency, as well as doing all the other stuff with collections and things. But there were kind of core kind of things where it's like, in terms of the technology we were using, our focus is going to be on text, and then we're going to be looking at visual image. So, in terms of being purely practical, was a core in terms of the research, but also in terms of collections. Obviously, the majority of the way in which things are represented is going to be text, and then you're going to have visual image, because obviously whether that's the documentation of entities, living knowledge systems, objects, or whether that literally is like a visual image in terms of the documentation with the text themselves, right? So I think these two are kind of like, it's kind of a given in that context. I think of the others, when it came to like institutional reading, audience reading, to me, because of things like, when I mentioned the commemoration of the abolition of enslavement, it's 200, was it the 200 years? I want to say it was the 200th anniversary, because I think it was back in like I want to say it's like 2006, something like that. So I was doing my MA at that time at Goldsmiths, and it was seeing that. I mean, it's a long time ago, but I think that over the period of the years, because obviously when they're doing like national program like that, it takes a long time for that to come out, and then it's lived by the people that are engaging it, and then you're going to have ideally some kind of reflection, legacy, evaluation afterwards, right? So it took a long time for that kind of feedback and things to come out. But watching things like that, but then other instances, there is, I think sometimes there's a disconnect in terms of how you read it. So for example, institutional reading. You have the way in which the institution presents itself, right? Public facing, that's a given. Like I said, strategies, I don't know, it's like their agendas, their policies, that kind of thing, right? But I think also many times, institutional organisations can be seen as monoliths. When there's people behind those organisations who have their own thoughts, who have their they can be different kind of factions, they can be different ways in which they want to see it. So when you then go behind and then you speak to curators and you speak to different people and you see what their passions are, things that they want to see change, the things that they're investing their research and their time and their professional lives in, it's a completely different context because they can be that disconnect. And for me, it's understanding both sides of it. That's why they're interviewing the staff and understanding their relation to a collection. Because many times when you may see objects in the area and they're trying to be communicated in the best way in terms of education, in terms of dissemination of information, all these different kinds of things, right? But then there's the other side of it is that you can't show maybe all of the research over one thing in one time when something's presented in the gallery. Yes, you can have research publications and different things, you can show all those kind of things. But I think what's really quite fascinating is like when I've talked to curators, like they have their personal interest in history. You know, there's things that maybe you don't see in the acquisition notes or the documentation that goes with a particular object. Like there was one that was a legal case that had been taken. It was like from Benin because it was being used because the British didn't get this right because I'm sure I remember it incorrectly. But the British were trying to take the palm oil trade. So then practitioners, so juju houses were being taken over, right? So because the juju practitioners were running the palm oil trade, so they passed legislation whereby they could be targeted. So if you could find evidence of them practicing, then you could close it down and then you'd be able to take over that section of the palm oil trade. So there was this like ancestral voice modulator. So I'm not gonna lie, it was made of human remains and I did see a lot of prayers before I went anywhere near it, okay, and the things that I do, rituals that I do, whatever. But when you talked through it, it would change the voice. So it was literally that you became, you know, that practitioner became the kind of like the voice of the ancestors conjuring for it. Incredibly kind of like heavily sensual, but incredibly, you know, very deep in someone's cosmologies. But this piece was taken, it had documentation with it as it was evidence in a legal case. Because then, you know, so this is what I mean, like the little things that, maybe not the thing that goes into the gallery that you see as an audience, but like there's all these different things with it, and you see their fascination, you see what they want to see. So I think that's a key part of it. The audience reading, for example, again, you know, seeing the way in which and listening to over the years and hearing how different communities have felt about when they go into particular institutions. I think, you know, we're all very aware of, like, so for example, conversations or, you know, calls, legal cases around repatriation of exhibits, for example. I think we both know the UK is a clear one in that, and we've had maybe 1-2 potential applications from just one place, I'm sure. No, there's lots of them. But at the same time, you know, it's the way in which it's not always necessarily, I think, when you've got specific objects that are keys of historical significance, where they got like things like the Benin bronzes are a key one that have like a lot of kind of publicity, I think, internationally from lots of different places, with this Smithsonian, or whether you're looking at the British Museum. But I think it's, you know, sometimes it's just the everyday things where you just don't see yourself represented because there's never maybe enough of your culture fulfill an exhibition, you know what I mean? Or there's not, I don't know, it's not seen as extensive enough, or it's not, you know, there's all these different reasons where you may not be like actually kind of represented, or if you are, there's a specific convergence of it. So to me, I think the audience reading is a key kind of thing, because you do have consultation, and I think a lot of places, organisations do that, a lot of institutions do that. And there's a lot to cover. I'm not going to say that either, you know, there's so many different societies and communities, but I do think also, you know, it's changed over a lot of decades, but, you know, I was born in the early 80s, so you know, there's a lot of years of like seeing that slow change, but you know what that means when you don't see yourself, and then it's a big deal when you do. I think Black Lives Matter kind of was a key aspect in that, but then again, it's even with that now, it's a social monitoring of like, right, how much is that actually been embedded and learnt from, and how much is that reflecting of a political, social period of what's happening? and then what happens in terms of organisations, people, activism following that. So then you need to look at that 2, 3, 5 year period and see what's the legacy actually of it happening, what's the 10, 15 year actually of that happening, and did it make that difference? And actually, do you see a subtle change in terms of policy and different things? With the eco-communal origin, that was one that changed because of things like, when I've heard or read around things like, you know, repatriation of like human remains, stuff like that. I think it's not just that it's sensitive in terms of the place of origin, but I think also many times I also think, again, you know, the natural world's kind of eclipsed. It's the region, it's the place, but actually, you know, the same way that you have a resonance in terms of the human, in terms of community spirit, is the same way that you have a resonance in terms of the natural world. When I said that thing about intergenerational trauma of species, you know, like species, for example, they learn to maybe like to fear humans after a while because they're hunted. Do you know what I mean? Like, I still think you can have that intergenerational knowledge and that kind of understanding and awareness because you learn those traits because it's part of survival. Do you know what I mean? So they can become genetic memory and embedded. So I think it's just, I think with certain things, understanding where they both are and giving them some kind of equity. So it's not just the extraction and use, you know, and it's not a romanticism there. It's just kind of, just even trying to observe it. I'm not saying it's always easy, but just even trying to observe it. And I think loss or damage, I think the reason I put them in this way is that I think they were key questions that I've seen over the years. There's key questions from conversations, from things I've had professionally over the years with different institutions. So different things, it's, let's say, private into the knowledge as well as professional knowledge and then personal experience, where I thought these are the things that I've seen come up again and again and again. And I'm actually positioned in this residency to talk to these, like what are national level organisations, to see what they think and what they feel about them. So they're not these monoliths, they're these people like who are dealing with it and what are the struggles and challenges they're facing as well. So that's the way I kind of thought about it. But yeah, it could be so much more extensive. I'm not pretending it couldn't be. You could probably take one and again, you could do much more in it, but yeah. No, that's all right. No.
Any other questions from our audience? I don't see any questions online. If we have time, Christina, I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So, you know from our conversations that I'm very interested in methodology within research, cultural research. And I wanted to ask you about the mapping aspect, or your choice to engage with mapping in your research, and how that may be in conversation with or contrast to the colonial act of cartography, as imposing kind of these non-Indigenous, very Western boundaries within the Caribbean, and how you're navigating that, and you know, if you do consider that mapping could also be a reparative tool within the context of your own research.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that, I mean, you literally look at maps. I mean, quite literally, you feel that kind of dissection in the cartography. When I look at, you know, some of the early maps, the National Archives of Barbados, and, you know, I was really shocked because I didn't realise how quickly the island was essentially put into plantations. You know, Barbados Day goes in like, I want to say 1660s, isn't it? And early, you know, by the early like 17th century, it's plantations. It's like, and it's, you know, when you see some of the pictures, some of the maps and stuff, you're just like, Jesus Christ, you know. And it's not just Barbados; it's so many other places as well. And the infrastructure, how quickly that infrastructure is, like the veracity in the way in which those colonial structures are put in. And I mean, forgive me, I'm sure at the time they don't feel like they're put in quick, but when you're looking over a longer term sort of record, it's just like, wow, things are set up and they're in there so quickly. The voracious nature of it is so quick and all consuming. But I think in the idea in terms of, I think it's two things actually, and I think I might have to ask forgiveness on this. I think sometimes I use the word mapping because sometimes I think it's the easiest way to maybe understand what I'm trying to do, because sometimes it feels like maybe it is following that colonial. I think maybe it is following, and it is following that colonial structure in some ways, but it's not. It's this. I guess for me, so many times the colonial history is on the kind of like is on the person, on the people, on the society and things, and actually the environmental aspect. It's not even hidden, it's just like non-existent in the sense of how it's recognised, of how it's recognized or how it's depicted, or it's like a kind of, you know, creative kind of like beautiful motif on a scroll, or like, you know, the fish that kind of denotes that this is like a ocean area section on a map. But I think with that, I think I'm literally trying to understand like the threads, the way in which they all kind of braid together, and understand the complexity and the breadth of it. Because when you really don't have some kind of voice of in any kind of way. So for example, this may seem a bit difficult, but to a certain extent, when you look at enslavement, people are property, and it's utterly dehumanizing, but they're represented in context of some kind of name. When you look at, like, you know what I mean, they're like, with its name or something, because it's the way in which they talk about it, it's utterly kind of so hard to kind of see, and to listen and to hear. But there's some kind of, they have no voice, there is no autonomy in that kind of context. But there's some kind of reference. But when you're looking at the marine environment, the whole thing's a void. There's more ocean than there is the land. Like Barbados is like literally this tiny little thing, like, you know, and that is just void. It really is just void. If you had somewhere the space of, like, I don't know, like the size of Russia, and it was just a void, how could you possibly consider that having like no voice, no representation, no speech, no kind of, other than to like just essentially just a source and for sustenance or whatever it is, you know what I mean? And just like, you know, in many ways I think that's, obviously we've seen that in terms of things, in terms of practices like enslavement and things, but this idea that there really is just void. It's not seen as having any kind of context in that. It's not seen as being a place where, for example, you're going to have intergenerationally, like, you know, families of a particular whales or particular mammals, particular species going in this particular route, and this is where actually they're going to recognise navigation or particular areas, or because they're going to have memory of where that is. So that it really is like void, this kind of liminal kind of space. But you see that then represented in ways in which I think many times when you look at relationships and practices where you do have relationships, I mean, you see this in places like Polynesia, for example, where you have representation in terms of marine cosmologies and stuff. You see different ways in which they're recognised. But I think in terms of the cartography, I think it's not mapping the void. I think it's trying to give some kind of resonance different way, and also trying to create a kind of ancestral, I guess, maybe a kind of cosmological practice that goes with that seems representative of it, because you've seen what happens in the kind of ideas of the colonial cartography and where that descends from, and then what you're trying to, because in many ways I think kind of feels going against the archive, because you're so aware of what that is and the nature of what it is. So I think it's me trying to find a way to kind of build that out as it comes out. I don't know if that answers the question correctly, but I think it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I'm hoping it does.
I think what you're doing are very important interventions into the archives and collections, both, you know, in the UK and across the sites here in the Caribbean that you're looking at. So thank you for that. If there are no other questions or comments, please join me again in, there's a question at the front.
Oh, hello.
How long does it take for you to draw a drawing? I don't know.
Huh?
I don't know. I've seen you do it, but I don't know how long.
But you're there with me in the studio. Okay.
I don't know how long.
Okay, thank you, Joshua, for your question. It's a very great question. How long does it take me to make a work? Well, it takes me quite a long time, in the sense that when I'm doing it with this one that you're in, because we took lots of pictures and things and films from when I was in Barbados, but you were too young probably to remember, because you're like 3 or 4, and I was on the paddleboard mapping the reefs along Paynes Bay, where Uncle Luther and everyone used to be. Because where's Uncle Luther in this one? You recognise Uncle Luther in this one?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's Uncle Luther, isn't it?
Yeah.
Exactly.
2 of them.
Yeah, that's 2 of him. So we do that, and then when I build them up almost like a collage, one layer on top of the other, and you know how you love comics so much? So Mummy kind of like draws it and outlines it. Yeah, and then I kind of colour it in, for want of a better word. That's not giving too much of Mummy's process away, is it? But it comes to the illustrations anyway, yeah. Yeah, there we go, Bunny.
So please join me in giving Christina
Thank
another
you.
round of applause. And thank you so much to my colleagues the museum, Ariel, and everybody that prepared this room. And thank you to all of you for joining us, both here and in person. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you.